The streets of Dar es Salaam no longer sound like the peaceful Tanzania the world once admired. Tonight they echo with the shouts of a generation that has had enough, the young, the restless, the betrayed. Flames rise from burnt polling stations, smoke mingles with tear gas, and yet beneath the chaos, something deeper is being born: defiance. This is not a coup, not yet. But for millions of Tanzanians, what's unfolding today feels like the final straw, a rejection of a coronation dressed up as democracy. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, once celebrated as East Africa's symbol of calm leadership, now faces a nation that no longer believes in her words. Her government has banned the country's two largest opposition parties, arrested their leaders, Tundu, Lissu, and Heche, and sent the army into the streets to maintain order. But whose order is it when the people themselves are silenced? Across the nation, young Tanzanians are boycotting the vote, chanting, "No leader without our voice," and in some towns setting polling centers ablaze as a message to the world: we will not legitimize our own oppression. The air feels heavy with history, like the moments before a storm when the silence of fear begins to turn into the noise of courage. As tanks roll through city avenues, the youth cheer the soldiers instead of fearing them. To many, the military now represents the last institution that might stand with the people, not against them. It's a dangerous hope, but it's hope nonetheless. So what happens when democracy becomes theater, when elections become rituals of control? Will Tanzania's youth write their own chapter of freedom, or will this day be remembered as the moment when East Africa's last illusion of peace collapsed? Stay with us, because what's happening in Tanzania tonight may define the next revolution of Africa. Please share if you believe that truth must come before ballots. Subscribe if you stand with the youth who dare to say no without guns, but with courage. To understand what is happening in Tanzania tonight, we must begin with what was taken away choice. In early 2025, President Samia Suluhu Hassan announced what she called an election for unity. But as the campaign season began, that word unity took on a very different meaning. The government suddenly banned the two largest opposition parties, including Chama cha Demokrasia na Maendeleo Chadema, and jailed its top leaders, Tundu Lissu, the outspoken reformist lawyer who once survived an assassination attempt, and Heche, his deputy and longtime ally. The official reason, as broadcast by state media, was national security. Authorities accused Lissu and Heche of inciting public disobedience and undermining electoral integrity. But on the streets, people saw something else: fear. A government afraid to face its own citizens at the ballot box. By the first week of voting, Tanzania was already tense. In Tarime, the rural stronghold of Heche, voters arrived at polling stations only to find soldiers standing guard, not to protect them, but to prevent gatherings. Some stations were deserted. Others were soon set ablaze by angry youths who refused to cast a meaningless vote. "If only one name is on the ballot," shouted a young man, "then it's not an election, it's an announcement." Across Dar es Salaam, Mwanza, and Arusha, the same pattern repeated. Young people poured into the streets waving homemade banners, calling the process a sham. Videos began to leak online despite the government's decision to ban X, formerly Twitter, and limit access to WhatsApp and Facebook. The clips showed running battles between protesters and riot police, clouds of tear gas, and voices screaming through the chaos, "We are not voting for our silence." Then came the most startling turn: the deployment of the army. Convoys of the Tanzania People's Defense Forces (TPDF) rolled into major cities under orders to assist police. Officially, the government insisted it was about restoring peace. Unofficially, it felt like a warning the state was willing to use its full force to control dissent. But something unexpected happened. Instead of panicking, crowds cheered the soldiers. Men and women clapped as armored vehicles passed by. Some even saluted. In their minds, the army, long respected for staying out of politics, might be their last line of defense against tyranny. One chant captured the new mood perfectly: "If the army remembers Nyerere, they will remember the people." The reference was clear. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the founding father of Tanzania, once said, "The purpose of government is to serve, not to rule." That ideal had defined Tanzania's post-independence era until now. And within the ranks of the military itself, rumors were spreading of officers questioning the president's orders. A name began circulating again: Captain Tessa, a young officer who weeks earlier had publicly criticized Suluhu's repression and been stripped of his command. To the protesters, he was not a traitor, but a hero, the conscience of the army. Meanwhile, reports emerged that activists from Kenya and Uganda who had traveled to monitor the situation were arrested and deported. Their only crime was showing solidarity. To many, it signaled that Tanzania was closing itself off from the world, a democracy turning inward, shielding its shame. In just a few days, Tanzania had changed. Polling centers had become battlegrounds. Votes had become ashes. And for the first time in decades, people were beginning to say out loud what once could only be whispered: the government has lost its people. And yet amid that darkness, the streets still pulsed with energy, not just rage, but conviction. A student from the University of Dar es Salaam, covering his face with a flag, shouted into a camera before police dragged him away. "We are not afraid anymore. We have nothing left to lose except the truth." That moment, raw, defiant, and unforgettable, marked the beginning of something that would soon move beyond protest. It was not merely an election crisis. It was the birth of resistance and perhaps the dawn of a new kind of revolution in Africa. As night fell over Dar es Salaam, the city that once symbolized peace became a stage for open defiance. What began as isolated protests had now spread across nearly every major town: Mwanza, Arusha, Dodoma, Tabora, a nation rising not with weapons, but with will. The climax came when the army's tanks appeared not as instruments of fear, but of awakening. Young Tanzanians flooded the streets waving flags, singing revolutionary hymns from the Magufuli era and chanting Jeshi na Wananchi, Pamoja. The army and the people are one. It was a surreal sight, soldiers standing still as crowds surrounded them, women offering them water, children climbing on armored trucks to wave the national flag. The line between state and people was beginning to blur. Inside government headquarters, reports said President Samia Suluhu Hassan was furious. Her command to restore order was met with hesitation among certain officers. Some commanders refused to advance on unarmed citizens. Others argued that suppressing protests would dishonor Tanzania's founding principles. One leaked recording allegedly captured an officer saying, "We are soldiers of the nation, not of one person." For a brief, fragile moment, it felt like the balance of power was shifting. The protesters sensed it too. The streets pulsed with chants of "Take back Tanzania" and "Release Lissu, free our voice." The idea of a peaceful people's revolution, once unthinkable in this land of quiet obedience, began to take form. But the government was not ready to surrender. Within hours, new orders came. Riot police launched coordinated raids across several cities, arresting hundreds. The state-run broadcaster declared that foreign interests were behind the chaos, the oldest excuse in the book. Internet access was cut off in multiple regions, leaving citizens isolated from the outside world. Still, the resistance found ways to breathe. Students from the University of Dar es Salaam began using shortwave radios to communicate between districts. They called their movement Operation Uhuru Freedom. Their voices, faint but determined, echoed through static: "We will not burn our country, but we will burn our silence." In Tarime, the heart of the uprising, entire villages refused to reopen polling stations. Women formed human shields around young protesters, singing ancient independence songs once used against colonial soldiers. The symbolism was powerful, a reminder that Tanzania's soul had not yet been conquered. Meanwhile, the arrest of Captain Tessa weeks earlier became a rallying cry. Graffiti with his name appeared on walls across Arusha. "Tessa didn't betray us. He warned us." For many, he embodied the moral dilemma facing the military, whether to protect the people or obey orders that destroy them. Internationally, reactions began to trickle in. The African Union issued a mild statement urging dialogue and restraint. Kenya's opposition leaders voiced concern, while Uganda's government called the protests internal matters. Western embassies, cautious not to upset a key regional ally, released sterile phrases about monitoring the situation. In essence, the world watched but did nothing. That silence only deepened the anger on the streets. "If Africa won't help," Africa shouted one demonstrator, "then we'll help ourselves," late into the night. As the smell of tear gas lingered and the gunfire faded, an eerie calm returned. From the rooftops, small groups of youth lit candles, thousands of tiny flames flickering across the skyline. They called it the Vigil of the Forgotten Vote. It wasn't organized. It wasn't political. It was simply human, a gesture of mourning for a democracy that had died without a funeral. The camera footage that survived that night shows faces illuminated by candlelight, tired, bruised, unbroken. A young woman, her voice trembling but resolute, whispered into a phone camera before it went dark, "They can take our leaders, but they can't take our eyes. We've seen the truth now. That moment became the heartbeat of the entire uprising, not the chaos, not the flames, but the awakening. It was no longer about one election. It was about a generation realizing that freedom cannot be handed down, it must be reclaimed. By dawn, Tanzania had changed forever. The smoke had cleared, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos itself. Streets once alive with chants were now lined with burnt debris and armored trucks. The police called it restoration of order, but in truth, the order that returned was not peace, it was fear. Across the country, thousands of young people were missing. Families searched police stations in vain, many finding only silence or denial. Community leaders in Tarime and Arusha estimated that over 1,200 arrests had taken place in 48 hours. Most detainees were under 30. Many were students, teachers, street vendors, the face of Tanzania's frustrated youth. In Dar es Salaam, a journalist whispered into a live microphone before it was cut, "They have taken our youth, but not their message." The message indeed had already spread far beyond Tanzania's borders. Videos smuggled out through encrypted channels showed soldiers standing still as civilians were beaten, young men holding flags in front of tanks, and women chanting prayers beside burnt polling booths. These images, defiant haunting, began to circulate across Africa. From Nairobi to Kampala to Lusaka, activists shared them with a single caption, "We are all Tanzania." Domestically, the government tried to move on quickly. State media declared the election successful, with President Samia Suluhu Hassan winning over 98% of the vote. Yet few celebrated. Streets that had once erupted with celebration during Magufuli's time were now empty, the air thick with disbelief. Even among the ruling party's traditional base, there was unease. Civil servants whispered that the country is stable, but the people are not. Churches and mosques quietly opened their doors to grieving families. Some local officials refused to certify results in areas where polling stations had been burned, acts of quiet defiance that the state could not publicly acknowledge. In the countryside, a more subtle rebellion began to grow. Farmers refused to display government posters. Teachers stopped opening the day's lessons with the national anthem. Small towns replaced official portraits of the president with images of Mwalimu Nyerere, the father of independence. It was a silent protest spreading like a shadow, not coordinated, not violent, but unmistakably united. Meanwhile, the Tanzanian economy began to feel the shock. Foreign investors froze new projects, the tourism sector collapsed, and small businesses shuttered amid uncertainty. Inflation soared, and the Tanzanian shilling weakened sharply. But for many citizens, these numbers meant little compared to the deeper loss, the collapse of trust between rulers and the ruled. For the first time in modern history, Tanzania's democracy was no longer believed in by its own people. The Constitution remained intact, the institutions still stood, but their legitimacy had evaporated. And yet, amidst this political wreckage, something unexpected was taking shape: solidarity. Neighborhood committees began forming to trace missing persons and document abuses. Lawyers offered free defense to detained students. Clergy from different faiths held joint vigils calling for the release of the children of the nation. What began as despair was slowly transforming into a civic awakening. People were realizing that democracy could not survive as a ritual performed every 5 years. It had to live every day in the courage to question, to organize, and to stand together. The government could imprison leaders, but not a consciousness. The Tanzanian people had seen too much, and what they saw could never be unseen. While Tanzania's streets simmered with anger, the world's response was a study in silence. The international community, so quick to speak when African elections favor their interests, now seemed paralyzed. Washington called for calm and restraint. Brussels urged respect for constitutional order, but no one dared to name what was plain to see: a democracy collapsing in real time. For the United States, Tanzania has long been a partner in security and trade, a stable ally in a region scarred by coups and insurgencies. American diplomats remember the Magufuli years when Tanzania briefly turned inward and Washington worried about losing its foothold in East Africa. With Samia Suluhu in power, many believed that partnership had been restored. But after the arrests, the censorship, and the tanks in the streets, even U.S. officials began to whisper privately that stability has become another word for submission. A confidential memo leaked from a regional analyst within the U.S. State Department reportedly warned, "If we continue to back governments that silence their youth, we will lose the next generation of Africa to distrust, disillusionment, and despair." In Europe, the tone was more cautious. The European Union hesitated to impose sanctions, fearing that Tanzania, like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, before it might pivot away from Western partnerships altogether. The ghosts of past hypocrisy loomed large, supporting elections on paper while ignoring oppression in practice. Across Africa, reactions revealed the continent's fracture lines. Kenya's opposition praised Tanzania's youth, calling them the conscience of the region. Uganda's government, on the other hand, expressed solidarity with Suluhu, citing the need to defend national sovereignty. South Africa urged dialogue through constitutional channels, while Nigeria remained silent, preoccupied with its own turmoil. Yet in the digital space, something very different was happening. From Accra to Johannesburg, thousands of young Africans flooded online forums declaring solidarity with Tanzania's protesters. Hashtags like Non We're Tanzania and Nos Democracy without guns began trending across African networks. For many, this wasn't just another election crisis, it was a generational mirror reflecting their own frustrations, rigged elections, corrupt elites, leaders who cling to power long after their mandate has expired. Then voices from across the Atlantic joined in. African-American commentators and Pan-African activists in the U.S. began drawing parallels between the protests in Dar es Salaam and the civil rights movements of the 1960s. One editorial in the Atlantic Review wrote, "Tanzania's youth are marching where ballots failed for dignity, not for votes. Their courage echoes Montgomery, Soweto, and Ouagadougou alike." And indeed, the mention of Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso, wasn't accidental. Many began contrasting Tanzania's turmoil with Ibrahim Traoré's leadership in Burkina Faso, where the young captain had rejected Western electoral models and replaced them with a call for sovereignty through service. In Western media, some commentators scoffed at Traoré's vision, calling it undemocratic. But among Africa's youth, his words resonated: better a leader who listens without elections than one who rules through them. That comparison began to sting. Tanzania, once a symbol of order, now appeared broken, while Burkina Faso under Traoré was being hailed by many Africans as a laboratory of honest leadership. The lesson was painful but clear. Africa's youth no longer measure legitimacy by ballots, but by truth. For the West, it was a warning. For Africa, perhaps, it was the beginning of a new language of freedom, one written not in constitutions, but in courage. At sunrise, the smoke had faded, but the silence that followed carried a different kind of power. Tanzania's young generation had spoken without winning, resisted without weapons, and defied without permission. Their protest may not have overthrown a regime, but it shattered an illusion, the illusion that elections alone can make a nation free. History is often written by those who refuse to be forgotten. From the ashes of burned polling stations to the glow of candlelight vigils, the people of Tanzania reminded the world that democracy is not a calendar event. It is a daily act of courage. And when that courage is punished, the people's faith in ballots dies long before the ballots are ever counted. What happens next remains uncertain. President Samia Suluhu may still hold power, but not legitimacy. Her victory speech echoed through empty streets carried by state radio, but ignored by hearts that had already turned away. Tanzania's future now hangs between two possibilities: reform or rupture. She could listen to the voices she tried to silence, or she could tighten her grip and risk turning East Africa's calmest nation into its next cautionary tale. The choice she faces is not just hers, it belongs to an entire generation of African leaders, still pretending that control equals stability. It is a lie history never forgives. For observers in the West, this is more than a distant crisis. It is a mirror. The same democratic fatigue seen in America and Europe, the same disillusionment, manipulation, and erosion of trust now burns under Africa's sun. When young Tanzanians reject false ballots, they are not rejecting democracy itself. They are rejecting its betrayal. And perhaps that is where hope begins, in the ruins of what we once thought was unshakable. Because somewhere in those streets, among the chants and the tear gas, Africa's next voice is forming. A voice that no longer asks permission to exist. So tonight, as you watch these scenes from afar, the flags waving in defiance, the mothers praying in smoke, the youth shouting into the void, ask yourself, do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or is Africa still waiting for more leaders who dare to choose justice over power? Because what happened in Tanzania may soon test every nation that calls itself free. Please share if you believe that truth must come before ballots. Subscribe if you believe that courage, not elections, is the true foundation of freedom.